Bon, bah, tu sais que c'est sérieux. On a vu pire pour faire des débats.
I know you from somewhere, but I don't know where. In a previous life?
Yes.
Il faut remplir le verre parce que sinon... Bon, il faudrait peut-être fermer le téléphone. Tu as fermé ton téléphone?
Je l'ai donné à quelqu'un d'autre.
Ah oui, t'es malin, toi. J'aurais dû faire pareil.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks to the candidate for being here in this outstanding occasion of showing your voters and European people which are your views. And thanks to my colleague moderators tonight, Professor Weiler, who's the president of the European University Institution, and to Tony Barber, Europe editor of Financial Times. Thank you all. So I think we can have our seat and start our debate.
C'est ça.
Ah, ça c'est 1h30.
So here we are. Our candidates know the rule. I introduce you José Bové, who is the candidate for the European Green Party. Good evening.
Hello.
Guy Verhofstadt, who's the candidate for the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe.
There you go.
Martin Schulz, who's the candidate for the Party of European Socialists. And Jean-Claude Juncker, who's the candidate for the European People Party. So here we are, and according to the rules we all decided together, you're going to have the floor for your initial statement. The first one who's going to have the floor will be Guy Verhofstadt.
Prima di iniziare il mio intervento, vorrei ringraziare la RAI per organizzare.
Before speaking, I would like to thank the RAI for having organized this meeting. It's an important step for democracy in Europe. My thanks to the RAI, and I would also like to thank the President of the Republic, Giorgio Napolitano, because he is an example for all of us in his struggle to achieve a more integrated Europe. Thank you, President, for being here.
So that leaves me only 50 seconds to explain you why I am in favor for a more integrated Europe. Because that is the reason why I'm a candidate. I think we can only emerge from this crisis if we do a jump forward in European integration. And that is at stake in these elections for the moment. Or it are the nationalists, the populists, the Eurosceptics, or we can find a new way forward for the European Union. And I think the way forward is not making new debts, is not the status quo or saying, for example, that we are already outside of the crisis, as some people are saying today. We are still in the middle of the crisis. And the way out is to do a more integrated Europe, integrating our banks, integrating our capital markets, integrating our energy markets, integrating the digital services in Europe, integrating telecom. If we do that, we use the scale of Europe to emerge from the crisis. What I want to do as President of the Commission is what Delors did in the 90s, the internal market, a new wave in the internal market, so that we use the scale of Europe to emerge from this crisis and to create also companies from the size as Twitter, as Google, as Facebook, who are today only American companies. Why we could not make also big European ones?
Thank you. Now, the initial statement will be for Martin Schulz.
Thank you very much, Mr. President of the Republic. Ladies and gentlemen, Sindaco di Firenze, it is an exceptional pleasure and an honor to be in such a prestigious place and to debate about the future of Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to become the President of the European Commission as the result of a democratic vote. This is a major change in European democracy. For the first time, voters have the chance to influence directly with their vote who will lead the European Commission. And I want to become the President of the Commission as a result of a vote of citizens and not as a backroom deal as it happened in the past. In the European Union, speculators make billions of profits, and when they make billions of losses, there is a difference. They make billions of profits and don't pay taxes, but when they make billions of losses, the taxpayers have to pay for that. And this is one of the reasons why unemployment is increasing in the European Union. We have no growth, and a whole generation in some of the member states of our continent run the risk to pay with their life chances for a crisis other irresponsible people have caused. So, the fight against tax fraud and tax evasion, and the fight for employment, growth and employment, and especially of young men and women, perhaps the best educated generation our continent ever had, will be on top of my priorities as President of the European Commission.
Thank you very much. Jean-Claude Juncker.
Mr. President of the Republic, it's a great honor to have you with us. Ladies and gentlemen, cari amici, before starting our debate, I would like to draw your attention to a tragedy which is happening in parallel to our meeting. In Nigeria, 300 schoolgirls have been kidnapped, and the kidnappers, extremists, they are threatening these girls to sell them on the markets. Nobody in this world has to be sold. And so I would like you to join me in my appeal to the worldwide community and to all the people involved to bring back our girls. These girls are our girls too, and so I would like to have a public appeal inviting them to come back to reason. The real only common point the four of us we have is that each and every one of us wants to be president of the next commission, and I will do everything to prevent you from doing so. I'm campaigning for...
We too.
Yeah, you too. I'm campaigning for Europe of solidarity. I don't like these division lines in Europe between North and South, between old and youth. I'm campaigning for a Europe of sound public finances, of growth-oriented and job-oriented policies. I'm campaigning against the Europe delivering itself to the populists and to extremists. There is no place in the European Parliament for the extreme right, and I will fight them.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Juncker. And so the floor for the initial statement to José Bové.
Mr. the President, I think it's important to be here today because this is the day of Europe. We are the 9th of May, and the fact that we have this debate on this date, I think it's a very important and symbolic moment. Europe is more and more important. We see what is happening in Ukraine. We need a stronger Europe if we want to build peace and if we want to give hope to countries and for people from Ukraine. This is very important. If we don't have a strong Europe, it's not going to be possible. At the same time, more and more people are suffering inside of Europe because of the politics which has been going on, for example, by the Troika. That means that we need to have answers, political answers, and not technocratic answers. That's why I want to be in the European Commission to say the new Commission is going to be a political Commission, not only working for the states, but working together with the Parliament. This is for us as Green why we are wanted this election to be linked with the decision to elect the next President of the Commission.
Thank you. Thank you very much. These were your initial statements. And so let's move to the first question. I will start with Mr. Schulz, asking him, we heard your statement, we heard promises and plans. How can you assure to your voters that when you're President of the Commission, you're going to deliver what you promised?
Keeping the promise. The rule of credible politicians is to announce what you have as intention to do and then to keep what you promised. So if I promise as President of the European Commission to initiate a rule, for example, to suggest to the heads of states and government that we should introduce in the European Union a common rule. The country of the profit is the country of the tax. All these people here in the room who are employees, who get their salaries here in Italy, have to pay their taxes in Italy. Why the companies employing them have not to pay the taxes in Italy? We should close tax havens and should avoid tax avoidance. Therefore, I will initiate a common rule of the 28 member states. The country of the profit is the country of the tax, and I can guarantee you, if I become President of the Commission, I will take that initiative. I cannot promise that it will happen immediately. It depends from the will of the member states, but one thing is sure. They will have me behind them the whole day when I become President of the Commission.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Juncker, do you think when you'll be President of the Commission, you will have the power and the means to deliver these kind of promises?
The Commission has, by the treaty, all the power the Commission needs, but the Commission is not the only player in the European Union. Member states have their importance, and you cannot lead the European Union to progress without being accompanied by member states. Member states, nations are not a provisionary invention by history. They do exist, and we have to work together with member states. I do want to have a constructive relation with member states, with governments. I do want to have a constructive relation with the European Parliament, and I would like to be supported by as large majority as possible in the European Parliament, but I'm totally excluding, and I'm not accepting that the extreme right and the populists are voting for me if elected President of the Commission, and if noticing that I have been elected because the extreme right was supporting me, I will refuse the mandate.
Thank you very much. Professor.
I would like to pose my question both to Mr. Bové and Mr. Verhofstadt. If we are to trust the polls, it's most likely that either Mr. Juncker or Mr. Schulz will be the leading candidates after the elections. But to become the official candidates of the Parliament, might be that you will be the kingmakers, because they will need your support within Parliament. In the spirit of this exercise of offering choice to the electors, do you think you should state now who you would support in that eventuality? After all, their plans are known. And at least would you say what would be your conditions for offering your support to one of the leading candidates to become the official candidate of Parliament? I think Mr. Bové should answer first, and then Mr. Verhofstadt, according to their agreement.
Well, I think this is an interesting question, but I think you don't have the real situation of the Parliament. Any movement, any party will be able to be alone to have a majority. This is the first thing. That means that very clearly, after the 25, the one who wants to challenge to be the commissioner, the prime, has to make discussion with all the other groups to be able to make a majority in the Parliament. How are we going to make it? It's not a discussion between us. It's going to be a political discussion in the Parliament to be sure that the answers which are going to be given to the candidate which could be chosen will answer to which kind of democracy, how transparency is going to work, how the work of the Parliament will be respected, and even the capacity of the Parliament be increased. And these are all going to be the questions we're going to have to debate. And this is going to be a public debate and in front of the governments. But I want to say, just to finish, that the governments are not going to impose to the Parliament
I understand, but it's our, attempt to be fair. Thanks.
Well, I can be very short. It is not the biggest party who has an automatic right for that mandate. That's not in the treaty, sorry. You need to build up a majority in the Parliament. And we shall see who is capable to build up a majority, if it is Mr. Schulz, if it is Mr. Juncker, or me, or Mr. Bové. And so, what is more important is that we shall not accept somebody outside the candidates. Otherwise, it should be the end of European democracy, and we can close the doors of the European Parliament. That shall not be accepted. And finally, we need leadership now. We got far too long, 5 years now. Mr. Barroso, it is not the first time that I'm discussing this with him. I have said him that directly. He is first phoning to Paris and Berlin, no, it's the other way, to Berlin and to Paris, before taking action. And we need another leadership, a leadership that is taking the right of initiative of the Commission to put proposals on the table, even when in Paris or Berlin they are not agreeing with it.
Thank you. Tony, I think the floor is yours now.
A question to Mr. Juncker. Is it not possible, even probable, that after the elections Europe's heads of government will in fact go to great lengths to avoid nominating either you or any of your fellow candidates to the post of European Commission President? And if that is so, what would be your next move?
If they did so, I would be very angry, because the 28 countries signed the treaty, prime ministers brought this treaty to ratification. In this treaty, we have the provision that the result of the European elections has to be taken into account, and if they are not doing so, they are opening the way to a major interinstitutional crisis between the European Parliament and the European governments. And by the way, they are telling the electors that their vote doesn't count. The result will be that in 2019 less people will go to polls because they would have been told that their vote doesn't matter. I'm of the opinion that the strongest party has the right in the different institutions to propose a candidate. Mr. Verhofstadt was saying that elections don't matter because the one who has won has to deal with the others. Okay,
no,
but
sorry, I didn't say that. Sorry, I said that the candidate who can first do an attempt, that is the biggest party, but you need to build up a majority.
Of course.
Sorry, a democracy is not the biggest and I am the best. A democracy is you need to build up a majority. That's democracy.
Democracy is not that the small is hiding.
Let me put the same question to Martin Schulz. if there were strong pressure from heads of European governments not to appoint the candidate of the winning party, what would be your move in that situation?
I think the European Parliament will not vote.
That's it.
Such a proposal. Let's say the heads of state and government would agree neither Verhofstadt nor Bové nor Juncker nor Schulz. We take, I don't know, Monti. You can be sure the Parliament will not vote. This is absolutely clear, not against Monti, but against the Council. So perhaps also against Monti, I don't know, but this is for sure. And therefore, I think if he would forget about the next European election, definitively, they should do so. They all, 27 out of 28 heads of states and government, made 27 out of 28 heads of state and government made a proposal. 12 socialist heads of state and government suggested me. 11 on a congress in Dublin, in a fight with a majority, suggested Jean-Claude Juncker. 4 suggested Guy Verhofstadt. I cannot imagine that heads of state and government appoint candidates in their respective families and tell them to the voters that was a joke. This would be a major damage to European democracy, and therefore I think they are reasonable and will not act in such a riskful way.
José Bové, what are your views on the situation that might arise if heads of government insisted on a different choice?
I think it would be very dangerous for democracy in Europe, because this election, for the first time, we're going also to design the presidency of the Commission. If the people who have been voting to the election, and we are trying to tell them, go to vote, because this is a very important moment, it's a new moment of building democracy in Europe. If at the end, the governments don't want to listen to people and the parliament, is going to be a big crash. But I am sure that the parliament is going to refuse the decision of the government if the government don't want to respect the parliament. And this is going to be, I think, a very crucial movement. So I tell to the governments, be careful with what you are going to do.
Mr. Verhofstadt, you have described this as a potential defining moment for European democracy.
Yeah, I think so.
You might hear the response from heads of national governments that they too have democratic legitimacy, they're elected, and the treaties set out their right to have a great deal of influence over the appointment, not simply to be swept aside.
Yeah, the treaty is very clear. You need an absolute majority in the parliament, you need a qualified majority in the council. So it shall be necessary to negotiate, but I think that the position of the parliament is very clear. It's to them to decide, but it shall be somebody who has a majority behind him. You cannot have a European democracy in which the council is deciding on somebody without that the candidate has a majority in this house. And I think for the first time what we see is not a direct election, but at least an indirect influence by citizens. We are going all the candidates in 28 countries. We have built up new pro-European lists in each of the different families. So for the first time, you shall see European elections that are different. Previous European elections were elections, a national test, a test for the national government. For the first time, I think, we shall see a European election about Europe. More Europe, less Europe. In Europe, out Europe. That's the key question.
Thank you, Professor.
So I would like to complexify it just a little bit. One of the worrying trends in European politics has been that although the European Parliament gained very considerable powers, voter turnout in election has decreased from election to election starting in 1979 till 2009. In 2009, it was about 34% of the electorate. One of the promises of what you are doing is the hope that there will be a greater turnout because voters have a choice. But should voter turnout be more or less the same, hovering around the 34, 35, 36%? what would your feeling be? And to add to what Tony Barber said, couldn't the European Council say if only 34% of the European electorate even bothered to turn out, the claim of the candidates, the claim of the European Parliament to be the Vox Populis is no larger than the claim of us, prime ministers, heads of state and government, who were elected and also speak for the European electorate. Maybe, Mr. Juncker, you could take this first.
Two of us, Guy Verhofstadt and myself, we were prime ministers, so I would not like to say that prime ministers don't have legitimacy. But when it comes to elections and when it comes to a turnout, the reaction of governments and the reaction of the political class to these elections is not function of the number of voters which went to polls. Elections are elections, and the result of elections have to be respected. If the Germans would have had a turnout of 30%, nobody would have had the idea that Mrs. Merkel should not be elected Chancellor. The same rule is applying to each and everyone and to all the countries in the European Union. The governments have to respect the result of the elections.
But Mr. Schulz, the government in the structure of European governance, the European Council also is a democratic voice. And as we heard, they have a say. So why should the final say be the European Parliament and not the European Council, on the condition that the turnout is so low? Would you really with confidence be able to say, I was elected by the European people if it's such a low turnout?
Yeah, what should I say? I was not elected by the European people. Since when the turnout is the decisive parameter? United States presidential election have a turnout lower than 50%. Is Barack Obama not legitimated elected? This is a strange argument of those people who want to continue to run the European Union behind closed doors without any influence of citizens. And we here are changing this wrong development in a good direction. Therefore, what we are doing here is already an achievement for democracy in itself. And secondly, the heads of states and government have not the last say. This is in the treaty. Article 70.7, you know it by heart, as I know. So the Council makes a proposal on the basis of qualified majority, and now the important moment, after consultation. That means first the Parliament is consulted, who is the candidate, and taking in account the result of the previous European election. This is parliamentary democracy. By the way, except the French president and the Cypriot president, all the 26 other prime ministers and chancellors are elected exactly in such way. This is a normal way of European democracy, and we are now bringing that way of democracy to the European level.
Mr. Verhofstadt, what are your expectations and hopes for European turnout? Are you concerned by the trend of declining turnout?
Yes, but I'm going to tell you the story that Danny Cohn-Bendit always tells to me. My friend Danny Cohn-Bendit says, yeah, you know, in Frankfurt, the city council and the mayor are elected with an attendance which is lower than the attendance of the European election. And nobody is saying that the mayor or the city council of Frankfurt is not elected in the right way. It's only when it concerns Europe. But I am optimistic. I think we can make it higher, this turnout, by giving an alternative for the way Europe has been governed the last 5 years. Because let's be honest about it, that's also the reason for a low turnout. People have criticized, for good reasons, the way Europe has been governed the last 5 years, in a far too much intergovernmental way. And what we need is to give to the people, to the citizens, an alternative, a vision for the future. And if there are, again, European politicians who are giving that vision, showing what the future of Europe is, then I am very sure that a higher turnout shall be the outcome of these elections.
And I hope this debate will increase the
Yeah, it can help, certainly, to increase it.
Mr. Bové, are you optimistic about turnout?
Well, you know, it's difficult to be optimistic in the reality of what people are living in Europe. People are afraid about the situation, and that's why we need to mobilize. And democracy is a part of the answer. is part of the answer. We have to say clearly to the people, Europe and the politics are two things completely different. We believe in Europe, we want to build Europe with its values, but at the same time, we have to change the politics of Europe. And this is the decision of the people. That's why what we are doing now is the first step for democracy. The second step maybe could be that in 5 years, the election of the President of the Commission should be elected by all the people the same day as the Parliament, a direct election. This should be the next step we have to go on. But what is important in this moment is to show that the Parliament has power, and the power of the Parliament has to be respected by the government, and this is a hope for the people.
Thank you very much, all of you. So now let's move in the field of policies and economy. So, Tony, would you mind to step in?
On the economy, let's start with José Bové. It's day one of the new European Commission. You're sitting in the chair as president. What would be your top priority measure to stimulate economic growth and create jobs?
Well, I think what is important is not to see in the future when we need to change all the rules of the European Union. We need now to have concrete measures. That means, firstly, that I'm going to work to have an autonomous budget for Europe. If we don't have a real budget, it's not possible to have an economic and a social policy. That's the first thing. The second is that we need to have a big plan for an economic and energetic change, because we have this climate change. And if we're able to answer to the climate change, we are able in the same times to answer to the change of economy, to build employment all over Europe. This is for us the main part of what we have to do quickly, but that means that we need investments. That means that the European Bank of Investments should be able to make this together.
Jean-Claude Juncker, what would be your priorities in terms of specific measures to improve Europe's growth and jobs record?
I would re-explain to the Europeans that fiscal consolidation is of the essence, but that growth-oriented and job-oriented policies have an equal importance. We cannot spend money we don't have. I would launch a far-reaching program leading us to organize a real, unique European digital market. I would relaunch the effort to complete the internal market in Europe, because the internal market has not been completed in the last 5 or 10 or 15 years. This would bring an added value of 500 billion to the European economy. This 500 billion without new debt would lead to higher growth and to more jobs.
Martin Schulz.
Around 1 trillion euros lose the member states every year in the European Union by tax evasion and tax fraud. Money we absolutely need for the investment in research and development, for our infrastructure, especially the digital infrastructure in the European Union, and therefore the fight against tax fraud and tax evasion is one of the highest priorities. Secondly, the money we get out of the fight against tax evasion, we have to invest especially in overcoming the credit crunch. In those countries where the relaunch of economy is most difficult are the same countries where the unemployment of young people is highest. And the backbone of such economies, like here in Italy, for example, is small and medium enterprises. But they have the problem, no access to credit. So to create a European medium and small enterprises credit program, and those who employ in the same time, when they get credit out of the program, young people should have a privilege. This is, in my eyes, the two priorities: tax evasion and tax fraud on one hand, and fight against unemployment of young men and women on the other side.
Verhofstadt, your priorities?
Well, I think that first of all we have to stop this unproductive discussion we got the last 5 years. You know, the discussion between austerity and debt financing. I think you need fiscal discipline because otherwise you cannot create growth on the midterm and the long term. But it's not by making new debts in the coming years that we shall emerge from this crisis. It shall only be the origin of new crisis. We need a radical different approach. We need a new wave in the integration of Europe as the way out. Let's use the scale of Europe to emerge from this crisis. A banking union so that we can stop the credit crunch. Unifying our capital markets to have lower interest rates, because it are still 28 different capital markets. If you have an investment project in one, you cannot use a property that you have in another country as collateral, as a mortgage. Let's create a European energy community the fastest as possible. And let's unify our digital markets, telecom markets and service markets by integrating again a new wave like in the time of Jacques Delors. That's the way to come out of this crisis. And no debt financing. That's clear.
I'd like to revisit in this context a question we asked before, but I'm going to ask it a little bit differently. There are differences among you. There are ideological differences among you. And that is good because it offers the European citizen choice. And before you said, of course, we can't guarantee, we have to convince the member states. And the Commission does have to do it. But our question is more pointed. How could you, as President of the Commission, ensure that the Commission would go along with you? Because before you can present the position of the Commission, it's a collegial body. Will you use your power at the moment of appointment of commissioners to ensure that your ideological vision, that your programmatic vision, you will actually be able to have a Commission behind you? It's a question that was raised in the course of today, and maybe we could start with Mr. Verhofstadt.
Well, I think effectively that a President of the Commission has to use two tools. First of all, the right of initiative. And not doing what is happening the last 5 years, for example, on economic governance. We have a good document on economic governance by the Commission, but the Commission never translated it in a legislative proposal. So we don't have a new governance model for the moment. So using again from day one the right of initiative for the Commission is the first big. And the second is you need, as a President of the Commission, also to make a team around you. And I'm in favor of clustering, so to make 4 teams in this Commission. One on foreign affairs, one of economic and monetary affairs, one on justice and home affairs is absolutely necessary, and then the cluster around the Commission President. And then I think it's absolutely necessary also to have a new approach in a gender balance in that Commission. Not by giving the soft portfolios to women and the hard portfolios to men, but maybe for once to do the opposite.
Mr. Schulz, I want to sharpen my question again. The innovation is that you are saying to the European electorate, vote for me because I'm on the left, or vote for me because I'm the EPP, or vote for me because I'm a liberal, and don't vote for him because we want a different kind of Europe.
That's a bad advice, but okay.
Fine. But you could have a team of foreign policy and you could have a team on internal market, but if they don't share your ideological view, you will not get a majority in the Commission. There will not be the ability to have the right of initiative. It can't just be a functional team. You said we didn't want technocratic, we want political. So how are you going to build that ideological coalition in the Commission?
Not necessary to sharpen your question, I understood it. But first of all, a small correction. You said you have to convince the member states. I said we have to convince also the member states. And that leads immediately to my answer to your question. What are we doing here? We discussed with Mr. Barber the question, perhaps the heads of states and government behind your back have already chosen another one and show the Parliament has nothing to say. The man or the woman becoming the President of the Commission is decided by us. And I'll tell you now a story. If I become the President of the European Commission as a result of a vote in the Parliament, with a qualified and sustainable majority in the Parliament, as President of the Commission, I will tell to my Commissioner, I have the mandate to lead the Commission in the direction for I fought to the voters, and I got a majority of the parliamentarians sent by the voters to the parliament. This is the line to democratize Europe and to impose the political line I got a majority for. That's what I will do, and I think the commissioners will understand me, I can be sure.
Mr. Bové, Mr. Barroso, President Barroso was here earlier today, and he very clearly stated more than once, he said, the President of the Commission should be political, but not partisan. Do you agree with that?
What was he? A monk?
I'm asking Mr. Bové.
A monk?
After 5 years, he discovered.
In other words, what he warned us, he said that in order to have, he said, ideological divisions are in Parliament, member state divisions are in the Council, but the Commission should be a mediating factor, not a partisan. I'm asking Mr. Bové.
Yeah, okay, but I
Let's give the floor to Mr. Bové.
No. I think, and this is quite funny to hear Mr. Barroso says that, because he was a political maker. Clearly, the line of the Commission was clearly political, but the problem is that he had no ideas. And this is the problem of Mr. Barroso, because the situation is that he didn't take any initiative. He was the minimum for all the 28 countries. That means that he had no capacity to work because he was not able to be upper from the countries. He was the minimum that the other can accept. And this, for me, was the big problem of Mr. Barroso. Being political at the European Commission, that means for the presidency of this Commission, to be able to take initiatives and to work for Europe, and not to work for the individualism of each of the 28 countries, because each of them have only one thing they want. They all, as UK, they all want their money back. And if we still go on with that way, we're going to break down Europe.
Thank you. Just a second before you give the floor to Mr. Juncker, I just want to let you know that Mr. Schulz asked for the reply, for the 30 seconds reply. All of them, they have 3 chances to ask for a 30 seconds reply. So to Mr. Juncker now.
Mr. Juncker, do you agree with Mr. Schulz? Would you adopt the same approach which says, I have a mandate for the people, I have support in the European Parliament, I can insist with my Commission that we follow this mandate. I speak for the people.
The President of the Commission has a double legitimacy. The one of the Member States because they have proposed him, the one of the European Parliament because the European Parliament has the final word and is taking the final decision by electing the President. So he's working on the ground of a really strong political legitimacy. I would like to have commissioners in my commission, if elected, which are real politicians. I don't like a commission of high civil servants. I want a commission of high-profile politicians. I do think that the President of the Commission has not to be partisan. The Commission, as Jacques Delors said, has to serve the Member States and have to have the general interest of the European Union on his radar. I do think that the outgoing Commission is not an equally composed Commission. There are, I think, 13 Christian Democrats, 11 Liberals. I'm asking myself why 11 Liberals. That doesn't reflect the real importance of the Liberals, and only 3 Socialists. This has to be recomposed in a way that you can really put together political elements in order to present to the European Parliament a real political program for 5 years. The President of the Commission has to be elected on the basis of a political program.
Thank you. So the reaction to Mr. Schulz.
Only one observation to José Manuel Barroso and what you quoted about him. The European Commission should not be politicized.
No, it should be political but not partisan.
It should not be partisan. I was the chairman of the Socialist Group when there was a broad consensus to vote Guy Verhofstadt, President of the European Commission. And there was a partisan movement within the European Council with one result. The proposal José Manuel Barroso, I find it a little bit hypocrite.
And I'm afraid that this is also why Mr. Verhofstadt asked for the second reaction.
Not only to confirm what Martin Schulz said, but mainly to say what we cannot continue is to have a commission who becomes more and more the secretary of the European Council. That is what's happening today. And there are very good commissioners who did their job. The problem with this commission was the leadership. A commission cannot be the secretary of the council. They have to lead. It is the only institution, ladies and gentlemen, who have the right of initiative in Europe. The only one who can put proposals on the table. And if you don't use that, if first of all you ask the agreement, the green light of Paris and Berlin, well, you eliminate, in fact, the driving force after European integration. And that is happening today.
Thank you. So,
returning to the economy, if, Mr. Juncker, you had been Commission President during the sovereign debt and banking crises of the last 4 to 5 years, what would you have done differently?
I was President of the Eurogroup during that period, and so...
So you bear some responsibility for the outcome?
Of course, I'm the only one who has to defend what has been done, because all the others are giving the impression that they were nowhere when it came to the responses we had to bring to the crisis. I don't think that the Commission has made major mistakes. At the very beginning of the crisis, we didn't have tools and instruments to fight against the crisis, and together with the Parliament, in many respects, having behaved really responsibly, we tried to define the instruments we need. And now we have these instruments. What I don't like is that these instruments are an intergovernmental creation. I would like these instruments to be introduced in the treaty when the treaty change will occur. But I don't think that the Commission itself has made a major mistake, because the commissioner in charge was a Liberal commissioner, the co-lead candidate of the Liberal Party in Europe, so it's not imaginable that he made mistakes.
José Bové, do you agree with that? Did the Commission basically get it right? What would you have done differently?
Well, I think there were several crises, and you're not able to say there's only one crisis. There was a bank crisis, there was a crisis of the countries, and there was a social crisis, and there was a crisis on investors. These crises make all this situation we have now. The answer on the bank was not enough, even if all the work which was done by Mr. Barnier, who made a good work, but it could have been stronger. But it was already a good direction. I think the worst policy of the European Union was to give the power to answer to the problem of the countries to any political decision with the Troika. The fact that the Commission, the MIF, and the European Bank take together the direction of what has to be done in the countries was not a good decision. There was no democratic control on the decision. And that's why we have the problem now in a lot of countries with a lot of people who believe that that's Europe. I say clearly, the Troika is not Europe.
Martin Schulz, if you had been Commission President, are there many things you would have done differently?
I think what we saw was at the beginning of the crisis a kind of quick reaction of the member states, of the heads of state and government in the Council. And I underline what I often, as President of the European Parliament, said. That was understandable. They were in a situation of need to react fast. This is acceptable in an exceptional situation. What the Council did then was to transform the exception in a rule. The German philosopher Jürgen Habermas called it a self-empowerment of the European Council, putting the ESM aside of the European institutional structure, putting the Troika as an instrument aside the European integrated structure. What the Commission did not sufficiently was to fight for the community method, which is the basis of the European action. And that's what I had done differently from the acting Commission, to fight more as he calls it always, integrated solutions, I would call it as solutions in the frame of the treaty, instead to create one institution after another, aside and beside the treaty.
Guy Verhofstadt, you've already made plain your strong criticisms of the way the Commission acted during the crisis. Is it not true, however, what Jean-Claude Juncker said, which is that the means available to the Commission were limited and not too much blame should be placed on its actions?
Well, I think you're not limited if an institution has the right to take all initiatives, what the Commission have. And I want not to be completely negative either. I think they did good work on the financial regulation, and secondly, they did also strengthen the Stability Pact. But that said, that was not enough. Three things should have been done. It's first of all not to create this mess in the Eurozone by saying from the beginning that Greece should eventually leave the Eurozone. That had created an enormous problem by the end of 2009. Secondly, I think that they had to solve immediately and to tackle immediately the banking crisis. The first thing that you have to do in such a crisis is solve the banking problem. And they didn't do it. We have to wait 5 years before we got this banking union, and now we shall have the stress test. Finally, I should say, 5, 6 years where the Americans have already solved that problem. And the third thing is that we need a growth strategy. Austerity, I agree, fiscal discipline, naturally, but you need also a second track to emerge from the crisis, and that is a growth strategy.
So let me just ask all of you a question that just came in from the floor, and not surprisingly, it's coming from an Italian, whose name is Vincenzo, and he asks, should you become Commission President, would you confirm the commitment to observe the current deficit deadline, or would you allow some flexibility? Mr. Juncker.
A priori, I wouldn't allow more flexibility. Countries have to respect their commitments. I'm happy that the Italian government, as the French government recently, was saying that they are intending to fulfill the commitments they have taken. If we are given the impression that growth can be based on broader budget deficits and can be based on higher public debts, this is not the way. We can't spend money we don't have. Fiscal consolidation is of the essence, combined with growth-oriented policy. Opening the way for relaxation is not the rule we should apply for the moment. I'm totally convinced that and France and Italy will comply with the engagements and commitments they have taken.
Mr. Schulz, do you agree?
The 3% criteria is in the treaty. We cannot change, and we will not change the treaty, so it must be respected. We have to discuss two things. What is our goal? To stabilize a country, or to stabilize a country only in one fixed delay? I'm in favor to stabilize the country with all instruments. In 1 year more is needed or not. We should not discuss about 1 year more or not. And the third thing is, I'm always advised by citizens we should think like big enterprises. Most of the big enterprises invest in their future with credits and not coming from their basis capital. And therefore, to look into the 3% criteria, what is a future investment and what is current spending? That is what we have to do in the frame of the country-specific evaluations in the frame of the European semester. So I understand Renzi absolutely by saying, please, let's discuss about future investment and current spendings, French government as well.
So, Mr. Bové, what's your vision on this?
I agree with Mr. Schulz on making the difference between the current disciplines and the investments for the future. And we have to be very careful with that. But this is not enough, because if the countries are not able to invest for the future, and they're not going to be able to do it alone, that's why the only answer with this situation with the 3%, it's acceptable if we are able, with all at the European level, to have collective investments, new investments on energy, on maybe transport, and so on. And this is why I ask concretely to have the capacity for the European Bank of Investments to go on very quickly to be able to build this plan. We don't have to change the treaties to do it. So we have to do it quickly, and we have the capacity to do it now.
Verhofstadt, flexibility or not?
Well, I have to tell you that I'm reassured because I have here an article of April of this year in which there is a dispute between Martin Schulz and the Angela Merkel chief of the Chancellor, because Mr. Schulz said that we should give more time to cut the public debt to France in April. So I'm reassured now because he has not repeated it, because I'm against it, to give more time to countries. If you give more time to countries, what you're in fact doing is to, in fact, lower the conditions of the Stability Pact. And that cannot be done. You know what happened. We did it once with France, we did it once with Germany, and then came the problems with Greece. So Stability Pact is Stability Pact, and giving more time is not serious. But the second thing what we need to do is a growth strategy. That's something different. That's making future bonds, project bonds, a common capital market on the European level. That has to emerge us from the crisis. So not by giving the possibility to making for a longer period more debt in individual countries, but by putting it on the European level with future bonds, new infrastructure, new investment.
If no reaction, we move to foreign policy. You're going to use the second?
No, I don't use my joker, but he is a funny guy because he said
he's using his joker. That is the way.
So I didn't come back.
That's a joker, eh?
That's another one, by the way. Shall we move to foreign policy?
No, I didn't come back to the point because Juncker already said the French government declared they don't need more time. Therefore, I have not commented, but I was quite clear. If needed, and countries need more time, we should focus on the stabilization, not on the delay.
Yeah. That's quite a change in mind. It's good.
We want to change subject and move a little bit to foreign policy. And I have a question about the Ukraine. So everybody is, of course, condemning what Mr. Putin has done and what Mr. Putin is threatening to do. But when it comes to what action Europe should take, there seem to be difference of views both among governments of member states and also in public opinion. Some states and some segments of public opinion favor a very robust, of course not military, but a very robust regime of sanctions, even if it hurts Europe a bit. And others talk about a softer approach, talking, minding our own business, etc. And I would like to know where you stand on the appropriate response of Europe to the unfolding situation in the Ukraine. Perhaps, Mr. Schulz, you can start.
The Russian Federation is a member of the Security Council of the United Nations with a veto right, putting often their veto, arguing this is a break of international law. And therefore we should address to the Russian Federation unilateral annexation of a part of another country is a break of international law. We have to condemn, and therefore the debate about sanctions were absolutely justified. Secondly, for the first time since the end of the Second World War, citizens in Europe could see that we have not yet making disappeared war and the risk of war. Within the European Union, yes. At the borders of the European Union, no. Therefore, stabilization of Ukraine is in the highest interest of our citizens. And therefore, we need also cooperation with Russia. Therefore, sanctions in case of necessity, yes. Tough sanctions mean we should tell us to our citizens higher gas prices, higher energy prices, and no investment of European companies in Ukraine and in Russia, in Russia. But we should also try to look for diplomatic solutions, and diplomatic solutions start always with one thing: to look, are there shared and common interests so strong that to deepen the common interest could reduce the tensions, and that's what I suggest.
Mr. Verhofstadt.
Well, I was on Maidan on the 20th of February when the killings happened. And I have seen in the eyes of the people there what is at stake. It's not a geopolitical fight between Europe and Putin. It's about the will of these people, ordinary citizens, to live in a normal, decent country without corruption. It's about that. And it's our duty to help them. It should be a shame if we Europeans don't want to give them a chance to live in such a country. And for that, I'm for more bolder sanctions. Bolder sanctions in the sense not of economic sanctions that shall take at least 3 years before we have an agreement in the European Union because of our differences of interest. I'm more for personal sanctions, tackling the inner circle around Putin. And the inner circle around Putin are the oligarchs, the people who are in the lead of these state companies and state conglomerates. We have to limit their visa bans. We have to go behind, to block their accounts, bank accounts, and we have to go behind their fortune that is mainly, that you find mainly in Western Europe. That is what we need to do, and not to have fear, because the ordinary citizens in Ukraine are waiting to live in a decent and democratic country, and we can help them.
Mr. Bové.
What I think we have to say clearly is that at the geopolitical view of Mr. Putin is clearly he wants to make a bigger control of the area, not only Ukraine, but several countries around. That means that Europe has to be strong and to have a voice and one voice to answer. I agree with Mr. Verhofstadt says, but at the end, we have election on the 25th of May, and this election has to happen in Ukraine. And this should be the work also of Europe to help Ukraine to make this election. That means that this election is not to cut Ukraine or to make a federal Ukraine, but to say also to the government of Ukraine, you have to bring people from all the areas in the same government. And in the same times, we need to have a completely new energy politics to depend no more with Russia, but to have a low carbon program for energy. That way, they have no way to go in front of us.
Mr. Juncker.
As the European Union is a value-based union, we had to stand up against the violation of the international law by Mr. Putin, and we had to take some actions and reactions. We don't want to go for war. I do think that we have military symmetries enough in Europe. So let's stop this stupidity of threatening Russia with a war. That's total nonsense. It would be a crime. War is not a response to the problems of the 21st century. But if Mr. Putin is not changing his behavior, of course we have to step up the economic sanctions. But we have to have on our radar the fact that these sanctions, economic sanctions and financial services sanctions will hit the different European countries in a very different way. I was in Latvia, I was in Bulgaria, I was in Finland. The Russian part of the Finnish external trade is 14%. In Germany, it's 2%. So Finland will be hit by far more than Germany or other states. So we have to organize an inner European solidarity when it comes to economic sanctions. But we have to take harsh economic sanctions if Russia is not changing its behavior on the ground.
Now, the European Union tried in late 2009 to strengthen its foreign policy machinery by appointing a new head of foreign policy who for the first time also sat in the European Commission, Baroness Catherine Ashton. It also established a new diplomatic service, the External Action Service. My question is, were these initiatives a success? What would you do to strengthen European foreign policy in the coming 5 years? I put the question first to Guy Verhofstadt.
Well, in the Parliament and in discussions in the Parliament, I was always very critical to Mrs. Ashton because there is a lack of strategy. We are still working, you know, with a document, a paper of 2003 made by Javier Solana. about the strategic choices on foreign policy of the Union. It's completely crazy. In the meanwhile, we got the Arab Spring. In the meanwhile, we got the problems with Iran. We got now what's happening with, in the neighborhood of the Union. So we need, first of all, a new strategic paper. What are our interests? What are our tools? And how we shall use this? And in that respect, and that's my second point, I think that we have to make efforts on defense and defense community. The time is now there to come back to a bad decision that the French Assembly has taken in 1954, not to have this defense community in Europe. As a pillar, a European pillar of NATO, eventually. But only when you have a common instrument, like a European defense, I believe that you can have also common foreign policy.
Jean-Claude Juncker, has the system worked over the last 4.5 years?
It was the first time that we had a high representative in the form we were witnessing it in recent years. I do think that the foreign policy and the diplomatic action of the Commission could have been by far more proactive, knowing that member states would have blocked that if ever this would have been tried. I do think that we are giving to the world the impression that we have 28 foreign policies. These are the foreign policies of our member states, and that in parallel we have a foreign policy number 29, and all these things have to be brought together. And I do think that we should start to work on a common European defense and on a European army, not because I would like the European Union to transform itself in a kind of alternative to NATO. I do think that a soft power like the European Union needs to have defense credibility. We don't have it for the time being.
José Bové, how has, in your view, the new system worked over the last 4 to 5 years in foreign policy? And do you support a more integrated defense posture for Europe?
I think we need to have a clear answer. Is it coherent to have 28 ambassadors in Kuala Lumpur? Is this the answer of Europe? It's a crazy answer. That means that we need clearly to have only integrated European policy, or 27 as you want. It's not a problem. The fact is that this is completely incredible. Is it clever in this moment to have 1,800,000 soldiers in Europe which are no use for the European protection? It should be better to have 300,000 real soldiers, European soldiers, to build a European policy. That means that we need a sovereign policy, defense policy, and this is the way we can do it.
May I give a figure of that to prove that? 42%, well, it's not a joker, but okay. 42%, that are the expenditures in Europe compared to the Americans. 42%, it's an enormous amount. But on the ground, we are only capable to do 10% of the operations of the Americans. That means that we are 5 times less effective than them. And the reason is simple. We do 28 times the same thing. That is the reason. So a step forward should be good for a foreign policy, and at the same time, maybe it can help to solve our problems of public finances in a number of countries.
I would...
It's a joker in this case.
That's my first joker.
Sure.
I would like to add that the only serious country when it comes to foreign policy and to common foreign policy is Luxembourg, because we don't have an ambassador in Kuala Lumpur.
Kuala Lumpur, yeah, that's true. I think it's a Belgian ambassador who was doing the consulate for...
That's your impression, but it's in fact the Dutch.
Let us hear Martin Schulz's thoughts.
I think the European Union is in foreign and security question as strong as the member states allow the Union to be strong. I give you an example. Cathy Ashton made, in my eyes, one of the biggest successes of the European Union during the last years, to avoid a military confrontation between Israel and Iran. The Iran-EU talks about nuclear disarmament in Iran was one of the biggest successes of the European foreign affairs policy. Katie Ashton negotiated the agreements with Moldavia and Georgia. We signed, in difference to the association agreement with Ukraine, we signed with Moldavia and Georgia. This was a big success. Nobody speaks about that. But once the foreign affairs minister of Germany, Poland, and France are on the place, everybody speaks about that. So once more, I think it was a success. She did a lot of good things to create this soft power of the European Union, but she is only blamed when the Union is not effective. Most in the times the Union is not effective, it is because of the incoherence of the foreign affairs ministers.
Okay,
I present my excuses to the foreign affairs minister of Italy, which is excluded from the critics.
You are the exception, eh? You are the exception.
You are the exception.
Which is nice, but let's stay on foreign policy for a second, because there's an issue which is so close to us, which is Middle East. It's the other side of the Mediterranean. And at this moment, it looks like that the US initiative is not succeeding that much. So do you think that as president of the Commission, you will be able to do something more on that issue? Monsieur Bové.
Well, I think the situation is getting worse and worse. We have a bad situation in Syria, but the situation in Israel and Palestine is still not ended. And so we have a global problem in this area. And that means that Europe has to be very clear on the situation. We have a clear position, but we were not able to do anything in Syria to bring democracy. And we still have the dictator in Syria. So we need to put this on. On the conflict between Israel and Palestine, I think that Europe has to take more strong positions to be sure that all the decisions of the United Nations are respected. And this is not clearly the position now, and that's why I want more clear positions of the European Union.
Martin Schulz, do you think we will have any chance of being more effective there?
The Middle East process is perhaps the most difficult political item in our neighborhood. And I think the two-state solution on the basis of the Oslo agreements should remain to be our goals. But if we look to the reality, it is, for the time being, as it was always, we have a lot of strategy papers, but often also a lack of goodwill. Not only on one side. And therefore, John Kerry and his initiative is perhaps a decisive one. If we will not achieve now, I must really ask the question, when? And the European Union is in a very difficult situation. We supported the Palestinians with a lot of money. We opened doors to Israel, but at the end, I think it depends from the United States of America and their impact on Israeli politics to go ahead. We, perhaps as Europeans, could influence more the Palestinians, but for the time being, my feeling is it is a pending situation. Nothing is moving since 25, 30 years.
Verhofstadt.
Well, I'm by nature an optimist, I have to tell you, but on the Middle East, not. And I think that the role that we play there is very limited, because people in Israel, in the political scene, not even want, in fact, intervention of the Europeans. And they are relying on the Americans. That's the reality, and we have to face the reality in that case. But I think that what we can do is in the neighborhood, is a real help to the Arab Spring, to North Africa, to the Middle East countries. And we didn't do enough, in my opinion. What we mainly did was to repackage existing help to Egypt, to Libya, to Tunisia, etc. And what we have to do is real to take our responsibility. What is happening for the moment in Syria, I find it a shame. That the international community is doing nothing is a shame. That we are doing nothing is a shame either. Not for the refugees we are doing enough, and certainly not to end what is a tragedy the end of a population in Syria by a regime that shall never accept normal values and a normal democracy.
Mr. Juncker, do you really think there's such a little room for European action?
In the Middle East, we have to act together with the United States of America. It's frustrating to see that we are in the Middle East payers. I would like the European Union to be amongst the players.
True. We are the payers.
So we have another question from the floor, and it sort of merges foreign policy with the external trade policy of the European Union. And the question of the floor says, there's often the impression that in some of the trade policies of the Union, and especially in relation to the agricultural policy of the Union, the interests of the European farmer, for example, are put above that of development and the developing world. And that if Europe is really to make a major contribution to developing country, there should be some changes, especially in the field of agriculture. So maybe, Mr. Bové, you could be the first.
The specialist.
Now, what we have to say very clearly, we had the CAP reform during these 5 years. For the first time, there's €0 for subsidies for export coming from the agriculture policy. Even if in the CAP, they say that it would be possible if there's a crisis, but in fact, there's €0 for export. This, I think, is a first step for more fair sharing agriculture issues. But the most problem for the developing countries are the free trade agreements which we are taking with these countries. And this is a new way to make them dependent on agriculture issue because the big companies are there to make pressure on them. So on one side, the European Parliament and the Commission make a good thing. On the other side, we're making maybe worse.
Mr. Juncker?
Common agricultural policy is an important matter in Europe. We are spending in the next coming years 408 billion euros. So this is, from a fiscal point of view, a very important matter. And we have given major changes to the common agricultural policy in the vein of the reform of mid-2013. And some of these changes, as José was pointing out, are concerning the external trade side of the common agricultural policy. I don't think that in the next coming years we can give major changes to the common agricultural policy. The reform of was decided 1 year ago, so we have to know that for the next coming years no major changes will be brought to the common agricultural policy after having drawn the attention to the fact that the external dimension of the common agricultural policy has dramatically changed in the course of the reform of 2013.
Mr. Verhofstadt.
Well, we need a dramatic change in our budget spending. That's clear. Let me give you one example. In the next 7 years, in the multi-annual financial framework, we shall spend 277 billion euro on agriculture. And at the same time, in these 7 years, we shall spend 1 billion euro on internet infrastructure. That is the bad choice that we are making today. And I think that the new Commission has to make a review of this multi-annual financial framework. I agree, export subsidies are now over, but they have caused an enormous problem in the local markets for decades, this policy of the European Union. And then finally on the FTA, maybe we can come back on the FTA in the next rounds on the free trade agreement, because I'm not so negative about it. I think, on the contrary, that it could boost economy on the Atlantic and in Europe. But without giving in on ecological standards, Certainly not giving in on social standards. It's not because you make a free trade agreement that from the beginning we have to think, oh, it shall be necessary to give in on ecology and on social security. That's not the case. If we stand firm, we can keep these standards and at the same time have the advantage of a free trade agreement. Because it's a huge thing. It's about a market of more than 800 million. That's a chance not to lose, I think.
Mr. Schulz.
I would like to answer after I say my joker. Yes. For the first time, we can make a break.
Mr. Schulz, are our agricultural policies and some of our trade policies harming our ability to help the developing world?
Yeah, I think if I understood well the question, my answer is it was a development question. And we should not put it in, first of all, in a trade frame. We should keep it in a development frame. And therefore I make a reference to what José Bové said. For the first time we have no subsidies of our exports, which destroyed in the past the agriculture in developing countries. If you look to the Mediterraneans, we spoke about the Mediterraneans. What we need is, for example, in some of the neighborhood countries, Egypt, in Morocco, in Tunisia, a sustainable development of agriculture there, by the way, on the basis of a new water management in these regions, which could produce sufficiently not to import to the European Union, but to produce sufficiently food for the whole region, because the Sahel region needs especially products produced there. Therefore, I think a development to combine development policies with agriculture development in the regions is the better way than to put it exclusively in the frame of our trade relations.
Yeah, quickly. First part, when Mr. Verhofstadt saying there's too much money for agriculture in the European Union and not enough on other budget, the problem is not the money which is in the agriculture budget, it's the fact that we have a very small budget, and this is the problem. Why do we have a budget which is less than 1% of the... So if we have a real budget, and that's why we want to have a prop budget for the European Union. That's what we are fighting for, and that's the answer for Mr. Verhofstadt. The second point, to answer to Mr. Schulz. The agreement, the free trade agreement, are killing the farmers, and mostly with the free trade agreement with Morocco. It was a very bad agreement. We fight it in the parliament because those who are going to export in Europe the tomatoes are not the small farmers from Morocco, but companies which are in France, and these are those who are making the exportation. And that's why it's a very bad agreement, and that's, yeah, and that we have to fight these agreements.
You basically used two jokers, but that's fine.
Have I still a joker?
You have one more.
We have one joker. And when it's finished, because you have to use it at the right moment.
We're almost there, yes.
I can come back maybe on one issue that we didn't discuss, the FTA, free trade agreement, a necessity for me in any way. Also to talk about privacy issues. After the question of Snowden, after the NSA, after we know for sure that the Americans are listening to all our data and looking to it, I think before concluding on a free trade agreement, we should have also guarantees on that issue. For me, there cannot be a free trade agreement if we don't also solve that problem. And we have the assurances that such activities stop and that the privacy of ordinary citizens in Europe is protected.
We're sorry, time is really running fast. But there's a question we'd like to ask you anyway, so we will try to do it as quick as possible, and it's about immigration, because when goods come into Europe, as soon as they're in, they become an European issue. When people come in, it's a member state issue. So would you please tell us your position on this? José Bové.
Before I answer on this, I think it's important to go on what he was saying on the agreements, the free trade agreements. There's going to have a debate, and this is a debate where everybody is talking in other countries on the free trade agreement between the United States and Europe. A lot of people are fighting this agreement because it's going to give the power to the company to break down the laws, to break down the way people live. And this is about GMO, this is about food, this is about environmental issue or social issue. This is a very big danger. And if tomorrow I'm the president of the Commission, I will stop this negotiation. This negotiation should stop, and I would like to ask to my three concurrents, what is their position? Are they going to stop the negotiation?
That's the old Bové is coming back.
Go on.
The old Bové is coming back.
You're all allowed to have your joker.
The old Bové is coming back.
Yeah, are you going to give us a 30-second answer on the immigration? Because you had another joker, so we use it for immigration. 30 seconds.
So for immigration, in the way it's working now, the answer is not an answer. It's only a police answer. Europe doesn't have and has no sense to build walls over Europe. We need immigration in Europe. Ask the German people, in 20 years, 60% of the people are going to be more than 60 years old. If we don't have people coming to work in Europe, there's no capacity for the economy. This, I think, is an important issue. After that, we need to have a political and social answer to the migrants, because people don't leave their country because they want like this one day to be, because they have no more money, they are in war, and that's the answer for immigration. That's the reason.
Thank you very much, Martin Schulz.
First of all, I think we have to recognize that Europe is a continent of immigration. There is still a lot of people telling me, no, we are not. My recommendation to them is to look what happens in the Mediterranean. We are a continent of immigration. And as all the big areas in the world of immigration, I think the European Union needs a legal system of immigration instead to push people into the hands of an illegal system which is leading to profits of trade of human beings with a disaster in the Mediterranean. I had the privilege to meet the Pope, and the Pope told me that he is the son of legal immigrants from Italy to Argentina. There was always a European immigration to other parts of the world. And the Europeans should not believe that other parts of the world will not immigrate to Europe. Therefore, like the United States, like Canada, like Australia, like New Zealand, like Latin America, we need a system of legal immigration. We need a system of protection of civil war refugees and the protection of political asylum seekers. Legal immigration means not, if you allow, this is on my side, on the left side in Europe, not very popular, but I say now. Legal immigration means not everybody can come to Europe, but everybody has a fair chance to try to get access to the European Union, as Europeans can get access to other parts of the world.
Jean-Claude Juncker, if José Bové is right and workforces are shrinking, populations are getting older, therefore Europe does need immigration, how do you persuade the voters? Because an awful lot of voters don't want that.
I know that a lot of voters don't want that, but this is not leading us to the conclusion that this has not to be done. If you are having a look in perspective to the next 4 or 5 decades, it's obvious that the European Union and the European continent do need legal migration, and we have to work on this legal migration, because a lot of details has not been solved in the right way, and we have to have this illegal immigration in mind when we are talking about this phenomenon. No human being is illegal, but we have to put into place a system fighting against illegal immigration, and we have to reorganize in a better way the European solidarity. Immigration, illegal immigration, waves of refugees, waves of asylum seekers are not only concerning Italy or Malta. I was in Malta recently, or Greece. It is a European problem, and we have to organize an inner European solidarity when it comes to this problem.
Verhofstadt.
Well, I think there are 2 things that are important. First of all, a legal migration policy so that we can stop with illegal migration. And with a legal migration policy, we can also discuss the burden, so that the burden is not only on countries like Greece and Italy, what is happening today. And that's not serious. And with a legal migration policy, you can have a serious burden sharing. And then secondly, on labor mobility is low in Europe. It's 2.5%. Labor mobility in the United States is 4 times higher, 10%. And we have still 4 million jobs that are vacant, vacancies in Europe. So I think that it's stupid now to criticize labor mobility. What we need to do is to put in place what I call a European mobility scheme that guarantees people who want to work in another country a European allowance if they don't find work, but based on the allowances of their country of origin. So that we don't have welfare shopping, because that is what people are fearing. Welfare shopping by people inside the European Union. And with a European mobility scheme, we could solve that and at the same time encourage labor mobility, what is key for Europe.
Thank you very much. We are arriving at the final stage of the closing statements, which of course you are each free to use in any way you want, but many in our audience would hope that you would use your closing statement to delineate as sharply as possible how your position is different from the others, how your candidature distinguishes you from the other candidates. So the choice is clear. Thank you.
And the order, by the way, I'm sorry about this, but the order is Martin Schulz first.
Thank you very much. My final statement will be quite clear. We discussed here tonight a lot about institutional questions. We discussed about Ukraine. We discussed about Middle East, about the foreign affairs policy of the European Union. If I would become president of the European Commission, I would for sure discuss about 27 million unemployed people in Europe, about 6 million unemployed young men and women. I would put at the first priority the fight against unemployment of young people and the fight against tax evasion. Speculators make billions of profits in Europe and don't pay taxes, and when they create with their speculation losses, the taxpayers must pay for them. The disappointment of families seeing that their children pay with their life chances for a crisis other people have caused is destroying the trust into the European Union. To regain trust and to defend the biggest achievement of Europe in the 20th century, this peaceful cooperation of countries and nations across borders in common institutions on the basis of mutual trust and respect, to defend that wonderful idea, we have to regain the trust of citizens who are not discussing about billions or foreign affairs policies or the Middle East, who are struggling to survive every day with 1,000 euros. That would be my priority, to put citizens first in the frame of actions of European Union.
Verhofstadt.
Well, I have in fact 3 priorities: jobs, 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 because that is the priority for the European Union. And to do that, we need to stop the old-style policies of the last years, of conservatives who are today saying, oh, we are emerging from the crisis is over, what is not true. And certainly we don't need other recipes by making more debts like other parties are proposing today. What we need is a new wave in European integration. Use the scale of Europe. Finally, the scale of Europe. It's the only thing that we have. That is the scale of Europe, a market of 500 million of citizens and consumers. With such a market, then we can beat Indians, Chinese, Americans. And for that, we need such a new wave. And finally, we need also to say very clearly that we need an alternative for all the nationalism, populism and Euroscepticism. Not only in Europe, also in this country, in Italia. Sono tanti dei partiti in Italia, tanti dei movimenti che vogliono uscire dall'Unione Europea e dall'euro.
Many people want to leave the euro, the European Union. This is a disaster for Italy. To revert back to the lira, to revert back to the devaluations of the past would be wrong. The citizens would end up paying the bill for this. That's why we need an alternative. The alternative is the choice in favor of Europe. And I always ask Italians to vote for Scelta Europea.
Presidente si sta alzando. Presidente si sta alzando.
When I was a child and a young boy, I grew up together with young Italians because many Italians immigrated to Luxembourg, but unfortunately I'm less fluent in Italian than Guy Verhofstadt is. I, as a president of the Commission, would try to convince member states talking about illegal immigration that a stronger effort should be delivered by member states as far as aid development is concerned. I would like this rich continent to try to resolve the problems where they do exist. Don't let the Africans take a boat. Help them there where the problems really do exist. I do think that in the next coming years we need fiscal consolidation, which is of the essence, and that we need growth and job-oriented policies and thus structural reforms. I do think that we need a Europe which is not accepting these divisions, these artificial divisions introduced in recent debates between the North and the South. I do think that Europe has to be the continent of solidarity, and that the European Union has to show the world that it makes sense to be an important soft power in the world.
Mr. Bové, you have the very final words.
I think at the end of this debate, I think that all of us, we have to be very clear. How do we answer to these Greek people who are not able anymore to go to the hospital? How do we answer to these young Spanish people who have no more work? How do we answer to these Polish or Romanian small farmers who want to challenge with the agriculture from the other countries? All these kind of questions are very concrete questions, and people live with concrete questions and they want results. So this is not only an intellectual debate, this is a concrete debate, and we need clearly to have some answer. And the answers are not from the old time, from the old economy. Clearly, as Green, for us, there's only one answer. We need to change completely the direction of the economy. We have to have an economy which is a green economy with no carbon. This is the challenge to fight against the climate change, but because if you liked the economic crisis, the financial crisis, the climate crisis is going to be worse. And that's why we have quickly now to change the way Europe is going on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It falls to me to close this debate and to offer some thanks. I want to offer all of you our thanks, and I think the thanks of all peoples in Europe. There's no doubt that these elections are different, and there's no doubt that it's thanks to you that for the first time going to election, there is some meaningful choice for the electorate. And whatever happens, whoever wins, that cannot be taken away from you. I would also like to thank President Napolitano. It was a gracious gesture on his part to come to this debate and simply say, I want to be part of this exercise in European democracy.
Thank you.
And last but not least, I want to thank all the public that has attended. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Good night.